Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Behind the Pulse. Vinny Camo here, and I'm super excited because today we're going to be talking about contract law, something that kind of hurts my brain, but I really enjoy it because it's very important for the music industry. And I'm joined by entertainment law professional Melanie Rodriguez. Melanie, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm excited to talk with you today because we're going to get into some nitty gritty and some stuff that I think is really influencing the music industry. And I think you're doing a lot of really great work. So I'm excited that we get this time together.
Awesome. Yes, I'm very excited to share what I've been up to.
I studied contract law in college and I did read a few contracts, but I couldn't imagine doing it for a living like you do. So I'm excited to get to kind of break those down. Can you kind of go into your past a little bit and talk about why you decided to study entertainment law and then specifically why you branched into music law?
Yeah, so I guess my kind of story, it starts in Austin, Texas. I'm really proud of where I come from because the culture there is very welcoming of music and entertainment and artists, and great things always come out of Austin, such as South by Southwest, Austin City Limits, ACL Fest. So growing up in that environment, it gave me appreciation for all things music, and so Austin has this certain charm and it's full of flavor. And so I have a lot of Austin pride. And when it came to decide, how I was going to where I was going to take my career, it just sort of made sense that I would combine, my love for the law and, having been a paralegal for, years before law school. I knew that I liked law. I knew that I was good at it, and I knew that that's where I wanted to end up ultimately. But it was really great to be able to find, a place like Los Angeles where the music industry thrives, and I could combine my love for music, my passion for music, with my uh, calling for law.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. And so you kind of used your like cultural upbringing. I've never been to Austin, but I've heard a lot about the music scene there, and I really hope to go someday soon. You're able to kind of take that and then I'm sure expand on it because you saw all this stuff happening in LA and you kind of want to be a part of that scene. So, what is your practice like now? Like, what is your work really involve today?
Yeah, so I mainly practice in transactional matters. And so that is writing and drafting contracts. I have a number of different clients. I've worked with artists, I've worked with small indie labels, I've worked with music producers, I've worked with sync licensing companies. And so I've seen and been exposed to and negotiated and drafted, a number of different contracts, for their business and for their music and things like that. So it's a little bit of a lot of things. And so right now I'm just kind of growing my practice and figuring out the next steps.
Yeah, that's fantastic because it sounds like you're really working with the local scene there and like getting to know, I'm sure, a lot of different musicians and record labels and things of that nature. Can you talk a little bit about your process of breaking down and analyzing a contract and like what it would be like for, let's say, a music label to approach a music lawyer? What would you do on your end once given contracts?
How much time do we have? So, without getting in too much into the nitty gritty legal jargon, I can say that I have a very meticulous approach when it comes to, analyzing contracts, drafting contracts. And I personally love the analysis and making of contracts. Like, that's fun for me. And it's why I do what I do. And no matter what anyone says, like one read through or one sit through and thinking that you're done is not going to be enough. Um,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
yeah, I feel like a contract is very much like a puzzle, and so the harder the puzzle, the more time and attention you give it. Right?
Absolutely.
Um,
I've uh I've read some contracts and I could read one paragraph for like multiple hours. Like sometimes contracts can be that dense.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so that's why it's not just, oh, I can read through it once and kind of get the understanding. So, when a client comes to me, and I guess it can be different, right? Because sometimes clients need to draft their own contracts, and sometimes clients have a contract. They just need me to review it and look over it and give them notes. So, like, I'll first ask, my client, what is your goal in forming this contract or signing this contract? And, do you have a certain goal or an outcome in mind? Because you want the contract to reflect that. And some clients know exactly what they want. They know exactly what they want the contract to say or should say. And others need to have more questions to kind of flesh out their ideas. And so I think that's the role of, uh, you know, a music lawyer or someone who does transactional work to really pick apart those ideas and make sure that they're kind of in the contract. Um, what I also do is I'm a very linear person. So I will read it through once to get the general idea, know where everything is, and then mark certain things that maybe don't look, just mark certain things to come back to. But because every word counts and every sentence counts, and a lot of times contracts will reference a different section or a different paragraph in that same contract, and they tie it together, and so I have to go read that section right away when I see it so I can see how it fits into the flow of what it's saying.
All right, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're like really breaking down and kind of mediating between all these groups, and you're really looking out for your clients so they have all their needs met and all their regulations and things of that nature all squared away. It's kind of interesting that you brought up that some people really know what they want in a contract, and then I'm sure a lot of people they don't. So you have to work with them and like understand how they can translate what they want into legally binding contracts.
Right, exactly. And, part of that too is if you already have a contract or you're drafting one, you need to be able to look at it from different perspectives. Meaning, if I'm, representing one party, how can I interpret what this is saying to me? Or is there any way that the other party can interpret it differently or misinterpret it entirely because, one word can change the meaning? It's very methodical and it's very meticulous, and you really have to have the attention to detail because one word or string of words can entirely change the meaning. So it's important to make sure that everything is in there and it's exactly what you want it to say.
Okay, that's interesting. And that makes me wonder about your decision to do entertainment law and then specifically from that, like branch into music law. Can you talk a little bit about your path in your decision of why to focus on this area of law and kind of what work goes into that in terms of what schooling and licensings you'll kind of need to get to where you are today?
Yeah, so to be an entertainment lawyer in particular, there's at least here in the United States, there's a number of you know, like checks that you have to have in order to actually, formally become an entertainment lawyer. I mean, you can work in the music space, you can work in entertainment, you can even be like a contracts administrator, which, doesn't require a law degree. You're learning the contracts, you're working through them and familiar with the terms. But in order to be a lawyer, you have to, apply to law school. In order to apply to law school, you have to take the LSAT and then, getting the scores for that. And then you apply to law school, get through law school. A lot of times in law schools, that's where you specialize. And, you can take certain classes of the type of law you want to practice. So if you want to do entertainment, there's a lot of great schools that offer good entertainment law programs, meaning that they have access to professors and access to companies in the industry where they can pull the talent from that will come and instruct you on this particular area of law. And then after you go through law school, you have to take the bar exam, and that in and of itself is like the final hurdle. It doesn't have anything to do with entertainment law. It's the licensing procedure that every attorney has to take in order to be licensed in that state. And that changes from state to state. So if you're in California and you want to go to another state, Sometimes you'll have to take another bar exam or you'll have to apply to get your license there. So it changes from state to state, from school to school, the procedures for how to do that. But that's about what it is in a nutshell.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. A lot of hurdles there. So it means to get to the
Yes.
point to where you are, you're pretty
Yeah.
legit then. What school was it that you went to?
I went to Southwestern Law School. It's in Los Angeles in Koreatown.
Okay, excellent. So I'm sure like you saw a lot of your colleagues once you started focusing on entertainment law and then get into music law. What would you say is like some effective qualities that you would want to have to suggest to other people that want to become entertainment lawyers and then specifically music lawyers?
Yeah, so you can have like full service entertainment lawyers which handle, kind of all types of entertainment. They know a little bit about film and TV, they know a little bit about music, they know a little bit about theater. They have multiple different types of clients. And then you can have lawyers like me who tend to specialize in one segment of the entertainment spectrum, and so that's music. Generally, I think the skills are helpful for, wherever you are in entertainment. But, some of the things that I think lawyers should have and clients should look for when they're, getting their lawyers is, I think number one is attention to detail and clarity, because many entertainment lawyers are transactional, like myself, where we are helping to draft and negotiate the deals. What do you want the agreement to say and why? Why is this here? What does it mean? How can we make this more clear? Those are the types of questions that lawyers should be asking themselves and their clients. So, no matter what subset of entertainment you end up practicing in, an effective entertainment lawyer can think a few steps ahead and guard against potential pitfalls, because if not, mistakes are really costly, and they're costly if it's not done right the first time, and they're costly to fix. And never should an agreement be drafted too quickly or drafted poorly written, because that's just a recipe for disaster.
Okay, yeah. So it's got to cover yourself, but also you're dealing with a bunch of other parties and a bunch of other peoples. So one little mistake could really end up being a whole mess for a lot of different people.
Exactly, exactly. And to that end, I think, another skill that attorneys should have is be able to, meet the client's expectations and building trust with your client, because you have to know up front, what they require, and also be receptive to taking suggestions, because at the end of the day, the role of an entertainment attorney is to advise and to get the deal done. It's not your personal intellectual property going out into the world, it's your clients, right? So you have to temper your advice with what they need and what they want, and advise them of any potential liabilities or pitfalls. But ultimately you do a good job for them and you protect them.
How about interpersonal skills and communication skills? Is every music lawyer like silver tongued? Is every music lawyer extremely good with other people? What do you think about that in terms of communication and interpersonal skills?
Yeah, so I mean that can just range with different personality types. I don't find that there's one mold of a music lawyer. I mean, I think commonly we all tend to love music, right? You're not going to want to specialize in something where you're not intensely interested in. So a lot of times there's like a connection to music. There's an, kind of a nexus where, for me personally, like I play bass and different instruments. And so I don't want to do it professionally, but I like to do it, just kind of on my own time and as a hobby. So, but I think it's really important to know that, I guess I should say, there's sometimes a certain persona or stereotype where you have to be mean or tough to get things done. And I think there can be times for that. But overall, I feel a good attorney is nice to people, because the entertainment law community is pretty small. The music community is really small. Reputation goes far and word travels fast. And so eventually you end up working with the same people over and over. And if you want to be able to work effectively, I think, you know, courtesy and likability can help you reach your client's goals faster and easier. And because lawyers are not just interfacing with other lawyers, they're working with all the different parties in the artist and, you know, the company circles. So the managers, the agents, the labels, the publishers, and that can present its unique talent challenges. So you have to maintain and foster those relationships.
Yeah, and it's those relationships with a bunch of different types of people that will allow you to not only be good at your job, but to get more clients, to understand other aspects of the industry. I can see where that's very valuable.
Yeah, yeah, and just sometimes, you know, just sometimes you won't get along with certain people, just personality wise, and that's okay, right? But I think to conduct business in a way that is inconsiderate, just as a matter of course, just can lead to trouble down the line. So,
Sure, sure. I'm kind of curious before we go into like modern contracts that you're looking at. Could you break down a little bit of how the music industry contract has evolved over the past few decades? Because I'm sure we're both aware, but maybe some other people aren't as much. How has kind of the modern age of music influenced the music contract?
it's a great question. So, contract law itself hasn't changed much. You know what I mean? There's always certain boilerplate language that you have to have in there, and I won't bore you with that. But there's certain things you still have and will always have that are present in music contracts. I think overall, speaking generally, music contracts are influenced by technology, and the subject matter of the contract can change, kind of trying to adapt to these new technologies, and then the rights that attach to those new technologies kind of also changes. Thinking back to the 90s, dial-up internet was barely a thing, you know. In 1999, I think it was, Napster began that, you know, that brought about the revolution of having music shared, you know, peer to peer, and you can download it instead of buying the physical copies. And, you know, iTunes came out and you could then buy singles for 99 cents. So then what happens to the album at that point? Um, Music became easily portable where you could just take it with you everywhere. And so those changes influence uh how contracts accounted for the ways that you can, you know, sell a record and what it meant to have physical copies and the way you would pay an artist. And so downloads are not a tangible media, it's not a tangible form. So how do you convert the sales of downloads to album sales? And it's not a perfect comparison, and the formulas are really complex. So um I think, you know, that kind of lends itself to streaming, where that was a big distractor in the industry, because now you don't have people buying downloads. You just have them subscribe to have the ability to listen to pretty much any song you want. So, how do you measure that in terms of the album sale equivalent? And so that's why streaming royalties are very convoluted and the ratios change over time. And so the contracts kind of have to be rewritten to account for those changes.
Okay, sure. And it definitely seems like we're accelerating with these changes now because of, like you're saying, this internet technology and these new ways of consumers receiving music. So then, could you go into a little bit of what the important parts of a modern music contract is like, and kind of how we have all that evolution, and what is like the music law community doing in terms of dealing with all this change?
I'd like to give a small disclaimer, my usual disclaimer, that, you know, please do not construe this as legal advice. It's just, you know, I'm going to talk about some general things to look for and very broad concepts.
Absolutely. If you're listening to this with hopes of writing your own contract, you're in the wrong place. Please contact Melanie and email her, and she'll hopefully you can get her as a lawyer and she can help you that way.
Well, thank you for that plug. I very much appreciate that. But yeah, so the specifics. for each contract will always vary depending on the parties involved and the deals being signed. So I want to caution people because it's not a one size fits all approach. I think all of the contract is important because, like we talked about earlier, every single word and every single sentence matters. But there are, like, the concepts I'm going to talk about right now are just some of the most general ones, and where there's like more room for negotiation and it has a greater effect, to the artist or to the party signing the agreement. So,
All right.
yeah, so speaking generally, the first thing to look for would be who owns the rights to what. What rights are you receiving or giving away? Sometimes you can negotiate to return certain rights, or you have them revert back to you at a certain time. And the easiest way to think about this without going into a lot of the legal jargon is that copyright generally is like a bundle of rights, and they can be split up. And so these are rights that are guaranteed to you um, by law, by copyright law. And so that's what I talk about generally when I talk about rights. And then secondly, you have to figure out how long are these rights for? How long is the term of the contract? We can be talking about something as long as the life of the copyright. We can talk about a set number of years. We can talk about an album cycle. There's a difference between the release of something and the delivery of something, which is also an important thing to keep in mind. And you can finish recording an album, but then there's a time period before it's finished and it's delivered that would satisfy the contract. So those are some of the two general things at the top to look for. And then another question would be, what are the requirements to fulfill the contract? Because sometimes there's certain things that are put in there, like morality clauses, which deal with how an artist can behave, in socially or kind of in the world. And it's important to understand the effects of these, even if it seems like you'll never have to deal with it, because you might end up having to, and you have to go back to the contract and figure out what it says, what you agree to, what you signed. So they're really important to pay attention to. And there can also be benchmarks too, which means in order for the contract to proceed or to be renegotiated, there's markers, there's measurable markers that are set, within that time period where you have to meet. And so I think the fourth thing to think about is, how are you getting paid? How are the advancements? What is it going to take to be fully recouped? And, recoupment means all the expenses are paid, and essentially you're making money at that point for, the record label. And then after that, it's important to distinguish, how is a record company getting paid? How are their fees paid? Who is paying for the expenses of recording the music? Sometimes they're passed along to the artist. Sometimes the recording company pays for them, but you have to recoup. And so it's important to know how that is happening, so you're not surprised when you get your statement and there's fees taken out, and you're like, wait, I didn't know that I was having to pay for these fees and stuff like that. So that's an important one. And then just to tie it up pretty quickly here, the last two I would say are, what are the royalty splits? And like we kind of talked about earlier, royalties can be really convoluted to understand. There's often a lot of percentages in the contract. So it's important to ask what that percentage is taken from. So, X percent of what. And then lastly, and one of the biggest ones is exclusivity. Can you perform with others? Are there carve outs for certain other forms of deals that you can have? If you're an artist, can you act as a producer or make music for someone else? Can you be a studio musician? Like, these are all considerations you have to take and figure out if you're only signed for this record deal for the duration of the contract, or do you have some latitude to do other things on the side?
Okay, well, yeah, there's certainly a lot of important things that go into contract. If that was the short list, I mean, we could talk all day about just those things.
Exactly.
And it's funny because all these things kind of seem simple on the surface level, but I'm sure everyone has heard of numerous musicians and record labels failing to do something on this certain level, and then their whole career falls apart or the whole business goes under because they forgot some simple things on the surface. But then I like how you kind of mentioned it. There's even things that within contracts for unforeseen circumstances, right? You even have to prepare for things you can't even predict.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where I think throughout, kind of going back and talking about how the contract has evolved, I think we've learned that there's always going to be a need for contracts, right? Everything in the music business needs to be in writing and accounted for. Everything all the time. It's not a handshake industry anymore, and it really never should have been, because that's where you get people misconstruing certain things and having expectations that are not met, and what you think it says it doesn't. And just in terms of, the terminology that's used, maybe you think it is one thing but it's actually talking about something completely different. So I think it's up to the artist to be always, to be able to handle their business accordingly, keep multiple copies of the things so that they're not lost, and just, keep an eye out for themselves and protecting their art.
Yeah, you're talking about like ownership rights. You hear that all the time with hip hop artists, right? Because they're always talking about owning their masters or losing their
Exactly.
rights to their labels. But
Right.
oftentimes that's what the contract was laid out for them, right? Like
Right.
multiple parties signed this deal knowing what these things were going to entail. And
Right.
so, as an informed person, not only on music law, but to have a good lawyer who can really break these things down, I think that is really important. So that's why I've been really focused on music law, because there's a lot of different situations in which you'll be dealing with contracts. So you'll have to know these kind of things. You'll have to be aware of the possibilities going forward.
Yes, absolutely, and be prepared for that.
So, talking about going forward, knowing that there's this huge impact on the music industry from the internet, from technology, from now live entertainment, how do you think contracts are going to kind of evolve over the next maybe 10, 20, 25 years?
Mhm, mhm. Well, it's really speculative, right? Because there's a lot of different industry players now that didn't exist 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and they'll probably exist tomorrow. And we can't predict, how change makers come about and end up changing an industry. And so I think they're just speaking generally, I think that there's going to be a push to make them easier to read, easier to understand, more straightforward, more transparent. I can think of the situation where there was a Twitter war, with Kanye when he released his contracts for people to see, and he was, like you said, he was alleging, I want to get my masters back, and so that's a really important part. And contracts can be written and understood clearly. It just needs to be done, and it needs to have, I think, buy-in from different, all the different people in the industry that are working together and saying, how can we make this more clear? I think
Yeah.
also there's a sense of like decentralization from the majors, and by this I mean you will have, more small and indie record labels that are able to provide more personalized service. And so I think there's going to be some trends that are going to follow from some of the indie trends as well. And I think, the contracts are also going to have to take into account new laws that go into effect. And, as far as the industry changing, I think there's going to be a greater push to have the artists keep the ownership, keep having better pay for artists. And the contracts are going to have to reflect the industry change and any new laws that come about. And that will be interesting to see. And I think finally, virtual reality, I think is going to be the next frontier in terms of music delivery. So I'm personally really excited to see where that's going to end up going.
Yeah, those are all really great points, and I think you're kind of looking in the right areas. I know with allowing contracts to be easier to read, I'm sure a lot of different people and a lot of different parties will appreciate that, but especially the rise of, as you mentioned to the second point, the indie artist. And I was going to ask you about that, so I'm glad you brought that up because I do feel like the rise in DIY artists are kind of shaking things up in terms of
Hmm.
music law, because we're seeing all these kind of independent players and all these small time people now like making it big in the music industry just from being at home in their bedroom.
Hmm.
And then lastly, with virtual events and with VR technology, I think there's a lot of like unexplored ground in terms of music law relating to those events and those kind of things. And that's going to have to catch up. And that's going to be really interesting to see how that develops and what music lawyers like yourself feel like is right in terms of creating proper contracts for events that we've never even had or thought of possible before.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's just kind of trying to be on the forefront, and what does that look like, and trying to anticipate what that might look like. And to your point about the indie artists, I think it's great. I think it's great that indie artists are wearing all the hats, and coming being able to come to a record label and saying, "Hey, I've already grown my audience. I've grown my fans. I just need you to help me kind of take it to the next level." And so that gives, some leverage in the situation. And so I really think that creating and fostering that, kind of indie mindset is really good. And there's plenty of companies out there who are helping indie artists grow their business. And but what I, kind of just want to do a cautionary measure is with the DIY music. Now you're going to have more DIY contracts, and those are becoming more popular. And I just want to say, don't do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Contact a
what
professional.
yeah, what you think you're saving in cost by doing it yourself, it could open you up to potential liability, and it's just not as easy as you think it is. There's things that you might think you don't need when you really do, and then there's things you can include that you don't need or can be counterproductive. And so contracts are very personal to the person or organization who needs them. And so I just don't think the DIY is as easy or protective or ironclad as people think it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely. That's why now I kind of want to go into music legislation without getting like too political and too
Right.
driven
Exactly.
into the politics thing. So I kind of just want to get to know your feelings about current music legislations. I know there's a bunch of big ones that like people hear every day, like DMCA or copyright infringement, things
Mhm.
of like that nature. And then the impact of all these modern changes we're kind of talking about, how that's leading music legislation.
There's kind of been a revamp in music legislation because um it's becoming more visible, and there's so many good people that are on the forefront taking on the challenges. And I think you could have and should have consider having a whole show on this topic. Just bringing in a music a lobbyist or someone that's really good at legislation, because there's so much that's happening in the legislative world right now as it relates to music specifically. And I think that would be a wonderful conversation to have, for artists, so that they could feel like they're a part of the conversation too.
Absolutely.
But just kind of speaking generally about some things that I've been seeing, in terms of the legislation. Late last year, the Case Act was passed, and that is called the Copyright Alternative and Small Claims Enforcement Act. And what that did, which I think is really cool, is it established a 3-judge tribunal. They're going to call it the Copyright Claims Board. called the CCB, and it's within the US Copyright Office, and it's going to handle small copyright infringement claims because a lot of times copyright infringement claims are very expensive, they are very tedious, and artists don't feel like they have access to that sometimes. And so it should start by December 27th of 2021. And so what the CCB will do is different from like going to federal court, is that they're going to be subject matter experts. They're going to have they know copyright law, they've been trying these cases, they will know this sort of stuff, so that ultimately the hope is that it leads to more consistently correct decisions, right? Because across the country, different federal courts feel differently about copyright infringement claims than other courts. So it's not always equal in that sense. So it's completely optional. You don't have to use it, but it'll be a good, low cost, less formal alternative resource to resolve disputes. And the only big difference about it is that, the amount of damages is going to be smaller. So it's going to be capped at like 15,000 to like 30,000. But I think this is good, right? It creates forward movement, it creates traction. And when we're talking about legislation, it's important to note that this particular piece of legislation was first proposed in like 2011, and then they issued like a really detailed report in 2013. And so the legislation was introduced multiple times until finally 2020 it finally came about and became codified. So we know that legislation can take a relatively long time. So but I
Yeah.
think that's a good upcoming one to keep an eye out for.
Okay, that's interesting. A long time coming. I know dealing with copyright as an artist is often something that's really frustrating,
Mm,
and work could get stolen in ways. And if you're a smaller artist, it would be pretty hard to get a hold of that and make sure you're paid out accordingly.
exactly, exactly. And so I think that will make it again just more accessible. It's not gonna have the same amount of damages that you could otherwise request from a court, but if it's a pretty simple case, and it can just be a time saver for sure.
Talking about music legislation, the Music Modernization Act did pass recently. Can you talk
Mhm.
a little bit about that and like the impacts it has on the music industry?
Hmm. Yeah. So, like I said, the MMA that can merit like a whole episode, because that was the first major change in legislation that affected the music industry in a really long time. So, without going too much into the nuts and bolts, I think one of the purposes of the legislation and one of the best things that came out of that legislation was to create the Mechanical Licensing Collective. And that collective, it's a nonprofit, and it helps artists collect their mechanical royalties. And it helps collect the mechanical royalties here in the US. They're going to issue licenses and then collect and pay those mechanical interactive streaming royalties from like Spotify, Apple, Amazon, like those kinds of companies, and they're going to pay them back to artists. So, in order to take advantage of that, what they've done is they've put a very user friendly website, and they're calling for artists to submit their information. So artists are going to need to be registered here as well, or have their publisher or record label make sure they're registered. And what that is, it's going to be a big database. So the more accurate the information, the better it's going to be in helping tracking these royalties and paying out these royalties. So for an artist, it's going to be good for you to go check and see if you're registered, and to take the necessary steps to register if not. And it's different than the rights organizations like ASCAP and BMI. Is just a way to streamline these interactive streaming revenues, because before they were just sort of put into a black box and no one knows where they were going. And so this helps make it more visible, and it helps just streamline the process.
Yeah, we're seeing finally artists being able to get paid out properly from these streaming services online, essentially.
Yeah, and I think, well, I think it's important to note that, the law is not quick to adapt to the new technologies. Legislation is oftentimes reactive in nature, not proactive. And so you can't really write laws to anticipate things that haven't happened yet. But the music industry is going to have to adapt to the changes in the law, and I'm sure we will see a change in the business practices to accommodate the changes in the law. And we won't know the future impact because it's hard to speculate what we can't see yet. So this has just gone into effect. And with everything, there can be good intentions and really great goals outlined, but the reality doesn't reflect it or it doesn't work as smoothly as planned. So the purpose is to try and help artists get paid. And I'm going to be, watching this space to see how well it's going to end up being executed.
It's interesting how you're talking about legislation is kind of reactive and you kind of have to adapt, which is exactly the same as the music industry, right? It's always changing and it's causing record labels and artists to have to react to it. So there's a kind of a parallel there between even if you're making music or you're making music legislation, you still have to try to be adaptive and constantly be moving with the changes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, it's slow processes, right? It has to be profitable for a lot of different parties. It has to work well with what's, currently in line, and if, to change something that could, have far-reaching effects that we don't see yet. So, um it just sort of it just sort of depends. And there's arguments on both sides of the coin. And some argue that, this extreme legislation might stifle creativity or, might lead to some other effect we don't see yet. But I don't know. I don't really see that right now. I feel that having certain legislation will ensure the protection and the fairness and the access for more people. And at the end of the day, good music will always be good music. And we see how vital it is to our lives, and that needs to be protected.
That's a great point. And I think that's a great way to kind of cap that section there. I don't have anything else written or prepared for you today. So I just want to ask, do you want to go over anything else, or do you feel like we skipped over something today that you'd like to expand on?
No, I think everything flowed really well.
Yes, absolutely. Me too. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show with me and kind of share your wisdom. I think you have a lot of really great things to say, and your perspective was really interesting. And I'm glad we were able to organize this.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that.
I will put ways to contact you down in the description of this video. So if
Okay.
anyone would like to get legal support or just know more about music law, please contact Melanie. I'm sure she would be very more than happy to help you out and talk with you.
Yes, absolutely. Please don't hesitate.
Melanie, thank you very much for coming on Behind the Pulse. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to seeing the changes in music law and seeing you at the forefront.
Thanks, Vinny. I had a great time.
That wraps up another episode of Behind the Pulse. If you enjoyed this episode, please check the description of this video. There'll be ways to contact Melanie as well as myself down there. Please like and subscribe to my channel here. It'll help me grow and find other great people to talk to as well. Thank you so much for listening. Peace.